The alien gods erased a civilization, but humanity carved its name into stone. They came as shadows across the stars, vast and incomprehensible, not fleets of ships or swarms of soldiers but beings so ancient, so immense, that lesser minds called them gods because nothing else fit, creatures of thought and energy who spoke in pulses of radiation and reshaped planets as if they were clay, beings that had watched galaxies rise and fall and had declared themselves curators of what should be remembered and what should be forgotten. And when they came for a world, that world ceased not only in life but in memory, for they unmade its records, burned its archives, shattered every monument, every library, every network, silencing all traces until it was as though the civilization had never existed at all, and across the galaxy countless species had been erased so thoroughly that no one knew they had ever lived, no ruins to stumble upon, no stories to whisper, no names to mourn, only silence. But when they came for humanity, something different happened, something small, yet sharp, something the alien gods did not anticipate, because humanity was stubborn, a species that had fought extinction again and again with nothing but grit and memory, and though they knew they could not stand against such power, though their fleets burned and their satellites shattered, though their archives crashed in a single sweep, though their very languages were collapsing under the erasure field, one man on a remote colony stood staring at a rock wall deep in the mountains and felt the spark of defiance. An archaeologist named Callan Vey, who had once dedicated his life to studying ruins of lost civilizations and now found himself staring at one, half-buried, half-broken, a monument carved into stone by hands long vanished, carved not in any human language but in patterns of chisel and groove that screamed one thing even before he fully deciphered it. We existed, we were here. They tried to erase us, but stone remembers what fire cannot burn, and Callan fell to his knees not in despair but in awe, for he realized this was the first proof, the first fragment of evidence, that humanity was not alone in its persecution, that others had been erased but not fully, that memory could endure in the most primitive of mediums, in the raw permanence of matter, and in that moment he understood that if humanity could not fight with weapons, it could fight with memory. He returned to his people carrying only a fragment, only a rubbing of the carvings, and in the hours that followed, as the alien gods descended upon the colony, unmaking their networks, erasing their archives, dismantling everything digital, he carved into the stone walls of the bunker where survivors had fled, his hands raw, his tools crude, but each stroke of chisel a strike of defiance, each word a scream in silence. We are human, we lived, we endure. And when the bunker collapsed under fire, and the survivors were scattered, some of them carried with them fragments of stone that bore his words, carried them like relics, carried them across the stars to Earth itself, and those fragments became the seed of something the alien gods could not predict, the beginning of a resistance not of soldiers but of masons and carvers and storytellers. On Earth, as archives collapsed and great libraries fell into silence, as data centers went black and histories vanished like smoke, people began to carve, at first in panic and desperation, clawing words into concrete walls and scratching names into broken metal, but soon with purpose, gathering tools, cutting stone, chiseling into mountainsides, carving names, dates, truths, and stories into matter that could not be erased, spreading from cities to villages to deserts, until humanity was no longer waiting to be erased but declaring itself in every stroke, and the alien gods watched with a cold, incomprehensible gaze, dismissing it as primitive flailing, unaware that in this primitive act lay a permanence beyond their reach. For humanity had stumbled on a truth older than the gods themselves. Memory written in flesh and light can be burned, but memory carved into stone endures until the stars themselves fall. And so, as alien forces erased entire archives of human history, humanity began a new archive, not in silicon or plasma but in stone, the oldest and most stubborn of mediums, and Chapter 1 closed not with the triumph of battle but with the birth of a new kind of war, one fought with hammers and chisels, with scars and permanence, with a truth humanity would carry into eternity. We were here. The fall of Earth began not with fire but with silence, a silence that spread across the networks like a plague, one by one archives blinking out, records vanishing, histories unspooling into blankness, and when the alien gods descended in their incomprehensible shapes, half light and half shadow, their voices like static against the minds of every human who looked up, it became clear that the war was not only for survival but for remembrance, because they did not merely want humanity destroyed. They wanted humanity forgotten, to erase every name, every monument, every trace as they had done with countless others before, and for a moment it seemed they would succeed, because weapons crumbled under their touch, cities burned without sound, and entire libraries collapsed into nothingness as though they had never existed. But in that despair something new took shape, not an army but a movement, not a general's command but a mason's strike, because in the ruins of New Delhi a group of Survivors dragged slabs of broken stone and carved into them the names of the dead, their hands shaking, their chisels blunt, but each name a defiance, each word a refusal, and when alien patrols passed overhead to ensure the silence was complete, they saw only rubble and ruin, but beneath it the stones spoke in grooves they could not hear, and across the oceans in the deserts of Nevada, children used shards of glass to carve stories into canyon walls, tales of their families, their laughter, their struggle, and as the sun rose it caught the carvings and made them shine, and others who saw them understood and began to carve their own, until an entire canyon became a library of survival. From the mountains of Peru to the ice of Siberia, from the ruins of Paris to the caves of Australia, humans turned back to their oldest instinct, the same instinct that had carried their species through the dark ages of prehistory, the instinct to mark, to write, to leave behind proof of their existence even when the world conspired to forget, and this instinct became their weapon. Soldiers, realizing they could not hold ground for long, fought not to defeat the alien patrols but to buy time for the carvers, to hold off annihilation long enough for names to be etched into stone, so that even if the battle was lost, the memory would endure. And so in the ruins of Warsaw one company of soldiers held a plaza for 6 days against overwhelming force while masons carved into the broken pavement the names of every child born that year, carving so furiously that their hands bled. And when the company fell and the plaza was crushed, fragments of the stones were carried by survivors to the countryside, spread and scattered, each one a shard of memory that the gods could not erase. The alien gods mocked them in their endless voices, projecting thoughts into human minds that said, "You are primitive, you are nothing, you are dust to be swept, your stones cannot outlast our silence," and yet humanity persisted. Carving in secret, carving openly, carving under fire, and each time an alien erased a monument, 10 more were built in hidden places, in caves, in mountains, in riverbeds where no fire could reach, and slowly the carvings spread not only across Earth but across the colonies, where refugees fleeing in battered ships carried tools and fragments and began carving into asteroid walls, into the cliffs of Martian canyons, into the frozen crust of Europa, even into the drifting rocks of the asteroid belt, so that soon the solar system itself became an open book written in grooves and scars, a book that no empire of gods could close. Among the survivors, a network of stone runners emerged, couriers who carried not weapons or food but chisels and instructions, who taught others how to carve, who spread the movement like fire through darkness, and though thousands died, their marks remained, every wall, every slab, every hidden cavern turned into a record of the people who refused to be erased. At first the alien gods dismissed this as futility, primitive scratching no different than the cave drawings of early humans, but when they turned their gaze across Earth and saw the patterns emerging, saw entire mountainsides covered in grooves that glowed in sunlight, saw symbols spread across continents, they began to realize this was not mere desperation but a new kind of war, one that threatened to undermine their purpose, because for all their power they could erase only what could be unmade, and humanity had chosen a medium that could not be so easily dissolved. And when the gods unleashed their storms of fire and melted entire mountains to slag, the survivors carved again into the cooled stone, refusing to yield, their memory reborn from the ashes. Stories emerged of small groups who carved their final breaths into rock before they were taken, of parents who etched their children's names into walls before being dragged away, of entire villages who joined together to inscribe songs and legends into cliffsides that sang when the wind passed through them, and these stories spread, becoming myths, becoming hope, and hope is a weapon sharper than steel. Callan Vey, the archaeologist who had first discovered the erased civilization's message, became a symbol himself, traveling from ruin to ruin, carving into every stone he found the same words, "We exist, we endure, we will not be forgotten," and when he was finally caught by the alien gods and dissolved into nothingness, his followers continued the work, each carrying a fragment of his carvings, and his name became the first of a new pantheon of human heroes, not warriors but carvers, not destroyers but preservers. And the gods, furious, began to unleash greater destruction, collapsing entire cities into dust, flooding oceans, burning forests, determined to scour every trace. But even as they destroyed, humanity carved, and soon the ruins themselves became monuments, the very rubble singing with marks of defiance, and the gods could not keep pace. On Earth, a great effort began, coordinated through whispers and signals carved into stone, to create the largest monument yet, a message not only to humanity but to the stars, and in the plains of Africa survivors gathered by the thousands, quarrying stone, carving for weeks under skies filled with alien watchers, building a monument so vast that it could be seen from orbit, and when it was finished it bore only 3 words in letters taller than buildings: "We were here." When the alien gods saw this, they unleashed their wrath, striking the plains with fire until the ground itself boiled, erasing the monument in an instant, but by then it was too late, because the message had been copied across 100 other places, and fragments of the carving had already been carried into space, etched into the hulls of ships, scratched into the sides of asteroids, tattooed into the very skin of survivors who swore that if their flesh was burned, others would carry the marks again, and so humanity became living monuments, bodies themselves turned into stone of memory, carrying their history in scars and ink. And as this wave spread, the gods began to understand that what they had dismissed as primitive was in fact unkillable, because stone endures, scars endure, stories endure, and in trying to erase humanity they had provoked something older and stronger than themselves, the primal instinct to be remembered, and in that instinct humanity had found its weapon. Chapter 2 closed not with victory but with a truth the gods could no longer ignore, that while armies fell and cities burned, memory carved into stone was a battlefield they could not win, and humanity, once prey, had become immortal through its refusal to be forgotten, every hammer strike echoing louder than 1,000 cannons, every groove in stone louder than the silence of the gods. The war shifted when humanity realized that the carvings were no longer just defiance but a form of communication, because scattered across Earth and the colonies were fragments of patterns, symbols repeated again and again, and when survivors began to compare them, they discovered that even under fire, even separated by oceans and planets, they were all carving the same things, names, yes, but also stories, songs, maps, and slowly these fragments formed a language, not the written tongues of English or Mandarin or Spanish but a new one born of stone, a universal script of grooves and angles that anyone could understand, a language too simple for erasure because even when a piece was destroyed, another would carry the same mark, and through this language the scattered human remnants began to communicate, not through fragile signals that could be intercepted but through carvings etched into places too numerous to erase, and suddenly humanity was connected again. With this connection came strategy, and for the first time the war was not just survival but resistance, coordinated not by generals but by masons, stone runners, and carvers who left messages hidden in walls, under bridges, inside caverns, each one carrying instructions or warnings, each one part of a vast underground network, and soon the alien gods, for all their cosmic reach, realized that humanity had become invisible to them, organizing not through machines but through memory itself. Battles began to turn in small ways, not victories but survivals where there should have been none, villages that should have been erased managing to slip away before destruction, ambushes where alien patrols walked into traps carved into stone long before they arrived, and for the first time the gods felt something like frustration, because their enemy no longer fought with weapons but with permanence, and permanence was beyond their grasp. In the ruins of Rome, where once an empire had stood and fallen, a gathering of carvers created the first great codex of the new age, not on paper, not on digital files, but on slabs of marble salvaged from shattered monuments, each slab carved with the history of the war, the names of the dead, and instructions for future generations. And when the gods struck and shattered the city into rubble, survivors carried fragments of the codex across continents, scattering its pages like seeds so that the more they tried to destroy it, the more it spread, until pieces of the codex appeared in Africa, Asia, South America, even on the moons of Jupiter, each fragment still legible, each fragment telling the story of defiance, and soon the codex was no longer just a record but a scripture, recited by those who had nothing left but memory, sung by children hiding in caves, whispered by refugees drifting in broken ships, and in this scripture was a promise that humanity would not vanish. But something else began to happen too, something even the carvers had not intended. Other civilizations, long broken by the alien gods, began to respond, because when human survivors carved their marks into asteroids and planets, they were not alone, and among the stars others had endured, weak, forgotten, erased, yet still alive, and when they saw the human carvings they recognized them for what they were, a message not just of survival but of invitation, and soon markings appeared in places humanity had never touched, different in style but unmistakable in purpose. Grooves cut into alien ruins, spirals etched into canyon walls on worlds thought lifeless, signals carved not by human hands but by others who had once suffered the same erasure. And for the first time in eons, the alien gods saw the rise of something they had long suppressed, unity among the erased. Humanity became a spark, its stone language spreading beyond its species, taken up by those who had no voices left, and the gods could not silence them all, for every time they destroyed one mark, 100 more appeared. Every time they crushed a monument, survivors rebuilt it in secret. Every time they drowned memory in silence, the silence itself became a canvas for carving, and what had begun as resistance turned into a war of permanence, a war fought not with fire but with symbols. Yet the gods were not powerless, and they unleashed terrors humanity had never seen, storms of energy that scoured entire regions clean, weapons that unmade matter itself, entire colonies vanished without trace. And with each blow they spoke into human minds, saying you will be forgotten, you will fade, you will be as dust. But the answer came back not in words but in stone, we are here, we are forever, carved into cliffs, carved into mountains, carved even into the bones of the dead when no other surface remained. And the gods, who had destroyed thousands of civilizations before, began to sense that this war was different, because no matter how complete their erasure, the humans found a way to endure, and endurance is a form of victory. The turning point came when a small group of survivors on Mars discovered that the alien gods' erasure did not extend to stone in its rawest form, that certain mineral compositions resisted the dissolving touch, and they began quarrying these stones in secret, shipping them across the solar system, embedding them into monuments that could not be erased. And when the gods realized this, it was too late, because humanity had already hidden these stones everywhere, in cities, in mountains, in ships, in asteroids, each one carrying memory that would survive even cosmic fire, and so permanence became absolute. Carvers began to dream bigger, no longer content with hidden marks. They began carving into the surfaces of moons, into the walls of craters, into the sides of canyons, so that from orbit entire landscapes bore the words of defiance. And the gods, seeing this, were forced to watch as their silence was rewritten into permanence. The war was no longer about survival, it was about dominance of history itself, about who would be remembered and who would fade, and humanity, though broken, though scattered, was winning that war. Callan Vey's legacy, once thought lost, returned when his followers completed what he had begun, carving his words not just into stone but into space itself, using laser drills and plasma cutters to etch symbols into the hulls of derelict ships, then sending those ships drifting into the void where the gods could not reach, monuments eternal in the dark between stars, and soon the void itself became a graveyard of memory, each drifting hulk a testament, each carved hull a story, and when others found them, they added their own marks, until the void sang with voices of countless peoples who refused to vanish. Humanity had turned the galaxy into a book, every page scarred, every page permanent, and the gods could no longer close it. By the time the third chapter of this war closed, the balance had shifted irreversibly, because while the alien gods still had power, still had weapons beyond comprehension, they no longer controlled memory, and memory is the foundation of civilization. Memory is the soul of a people, and with memory secured, humanity had become unkillable, its name carved into stone, into stars, into the void itself, a name the gods could never erase, and so the war had changed forever. The alien gods came in full force at last, not with fragments of their power but with the totality of their will, sweeping across the solar system like a tide of unmaking, their presence unraveling orbiting stations, tearing colonies into dust, their voice booming across every mind in a chorus of infinite coldness, declaring that humanity would be erased, that its carvings would crumble, that its name would be struck from the cosmos as so many before had been, and for a moment even the most Defiant felt despair because the scale of what they faced was beyond comprehension. These beings who could unmake stars and fold gravity like parchment, who had lived since before the first galaxies coalesced, who had shaped evolution itself in the shadows, these gods now turned all their hatred upon one small fragile species that had dared to defy them with chisels and hammers, and the skies burned red as if the heavens themselves were being scoured, earth trembling under the assault, oceans boiling, mountains cracking, cities shattering. And yet even as this storm of erasure fell, humanity did not retreat into silence, humanity did not bow, instead they gathered billions across the earth in the colonies, carving faster than ever before, not just on walls or cliffs or monuments but on anything they could touch, steel, bone, glass, ground, even their own skin, carving words that became prayers, carving names that became shields, carving stories that became fire, and in this great act of defiance the alien gods felt something they had not expected. Resistance not in weapons but in permanence, a permanence that deepened the more they tried to erase, because every act of destruction only created more space for carving, and humanity filled every scar with words, every ruin with memory, until the earth itself became a canvas of defiance, glowing under fire with grooves and cuts that could not be erased. And at the center of it all was Callan Vey's legacy, for his followers had completed the great monument he once dreamed of, not a single statue or building but a mountain turned into a script. A colossal carving stretching across continents, visible from orbit, words cut so deep into the crust of the planet that no fire could reach them, a story told in the universal language humanity had invented, and when the alien gods descended to erase it, to unmake even the planet beneath it. Something happened that even they could not anticipate, because across the galaxy other civilizations, long thought erased, answered the call, their own monuments stirring, their own carvings shining, as if memory itself had awoken, as if the persistence of all those once erased had found a single voice, and together they spoke not with weapons but with permanence, with the weight of history itself, and the alien gods faltered. For the first time in eternity they were faced with something they could not erase. Not because they lacked power but because permanence had multiplied beyond their control, because stone remembers and stone endures, and the carvings of 1,000 civilizations rose like a tide, each mark echoing humanity's, each mark saying we were here, and the chorus of permanence became deafening. The gods, who had unmade worlds for eons, now found themselves surrounded by the memory of those they thought gone, an army not of flesh but of stone, a resistance carved into the very bones of the galaxy, and the more they pressed, the more permanence spread, until they realized that to continue was to enshrine their own defeat, for their attempts at erasure only proved humanity's truth, that memory is stronger than silence, that stories outlast destruction, that to exist is to carve yourself into reality so deeply that no force can unmake you, and in that realization came the end. They withdrew not in defeat of arms but in defeat of meaning, fading back into the dark between galaxies, leaving humanity broken but not erased, shattered but unyielding, and in their absence the stars seemed brighter, as if the cosmos itself had acknowledged the permanence of what had just occurred. In the aftermath, survivors emerged from bunkers, from ruins, from scattered ships, and they did not weep in despair but sang the scripture of stone, carrying fragments of monuments, passing them from hand to hand, rebuilding their histories piece by piece, and for the first time in human history, all divisions fell away, no nations, no borders, no rivalries, only one people united by a single truth, that they had faced gods and endured, that their name had been carved into the cosmos forever, and that no one could erase them now. On the mountains of Earth, carvers continued their work, chiseling deeper, writing the story of what had happened so that even when stars burned out and galaxies crumbled, the stone would remain, carrying their name into eternity. And in the void, drifting monuments carried the same story, etched into derelict ships, asteroids, and forgotten moons, so that any who came after would know that humanity had lived, had fought, had endured, and had carved itself into permanence. Callan Vey's name became the first among them, not as a god or a savior but as a man who had seen the truth, that to be remembered is to live beyond erasure, and so his name was carved into every monument, every mountain, every drifting stone, the first chisel stroke of the war that ended with permanence, and his words became humanity's anthem, "We are here." And as generations passed, children grew up tracing those grooves with their hands, learning to read not from books but from stone, their history carved into the world around them, unburnable, unbreakable, unerasable, and they carried this truth forward. No matter what came, humanity would endure, not through weapons or fire but through memory itself. The alien gods had erased countless civilizations, but from humanity they had carved something eternal, and in the silence of their departure the galaxy whispered a new truth, one written not by gods but by mortals, one carved into stone and stars alike. The alien gods erased a civilization, but humanity carved its name into stone.